Hi there. Today we're going to talk about our follicular phase, which is the second phase in our feminine hormone rhythm. So after today, you'll know what the follicular phase is, what problems that we might see in our own body are from this phase, and then what ideally it should look like and ways we can nutritionally support ourselves. I'm actually making a whole series on all of the phases of our feminine rhythm. So if you'd like, you can hit subscribe and you'll get notified when the next two videos come out on this topic as well. Okay, so let's talk about our follicular phase. Our follicular phase, and that might be a mouthful for some of you. I just had a stumble that maybe I'll put at the end as a blooper, but that is the time where we are developing follicles, egg follicles called oocytes. And those eggs are developing. There's a few that develop and one becomes a predominant egg, and that requires us to have nutrition to be able to support that egg. And so let's jump down to my desktop and I will show you a little bit about what the hormones look like for this phase. Okay, so if you're looking here at our normal hormone levels for women, these are progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone again. And as you can see, the follicular phase is highlighted, and this occurs from day 7 till 14 approximately, maybe 13 and a half, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, depending on whether our hormones are in balance. And so this is just to give you a picture of what these hormones should generally be doing. As you can see, estrogen is starting to develop. It's going to increase, and our estrogen development also is going to encourage our egg or follicle to begin developing in our ovary. The next thing that you'll notice is our testosterone level is a little bit higher. And so during this phase, we are getting ready. We're ramping up to where we're going to be able to have more strength. We're going to feel sexier by the end of this phase because that's part of what estrogen does. Also, at the end of this phase, you're going to notice progesterone is starting to show itself. So we're going to have a little bit of progesterone production, and you'll learn a little bit more about that in the ovulatory and luteal phases more, but the corpus luteum is what's going to start producing that progesterone. And so by the end of this phase, the corpus luteum will be what the oocyte is developing into, possibly. And so that's where the progesterone is going to start to be produced. It's actually produced by that oocyte after it has kind of reached maturity level. And so some of these are going to help us feel stronger. We're going to be able to do more exercise, I've talked about before. And estrogen is a buffering hormone. So what it's going to also be able to do is help our bodies be able to recover faster from certain exercises or longer runs. So by the end of this phase, we are able to have more endurance. We're going to be able to do that long run if we're a runner. I'm a runner. And so that's one of the things that I do is during this phase is when I move to the next part in my training regimen. So if I have been in my menstrual phase a little bit more mild, doing more yoga and stretching and going lighter, then in this phase is where I start ramping up more of my running schedule or working out in certain areas where I'm going to increase my strength because I'm leaning into that hormonal rhythm where I'm going to be naturally at a more optimal level than I was before. And so this will continue throughout the follicular phase. So now you know a little bit more about what the follicular phase is and what it looks like hormonally. And I also want to talk about some common problems. Now these problems can arise for various reasons, but a lot of them are connected with fertility and they have kind of downstream effects like I've talked about before. So some of those might be not developing an egg. It's called anovulation, and that means that our oocyte doesn't develop. We might not be producing the estrogen that we need in order for that egg to be developing. Estrogen cues some of our other glands, things like our pituitary gland or hypothalamus, to produce other hormones like FSH that were not on that chart, and luteinizing hormone, which are important for egg development and ovulation. So we might even be developing an egg, but if we don't get it to the point of maturity where it is ovulating and at a point where it can move down the fallopian tube and into the area where it can be fertilized, that can also result in not just not ovulating, but infertility. If someone's goal is to be able to have a baby and to develop a healthy embryo into a child, then that's not going to be something that happens if we don't have an egg that has been properly developed and is handed off to the next part where we're going to ovulate. Another struggle that we can have during this time is anxiety. Some people with high estrogen levels, naturally for other causes, they can experience anxiety because this estrogen is peaking. And if estrogen for them is dominant in their body, for different reasons, and I'll talk about those in a minute as well, then they can start to experience some anxiety. Rather than maybe just having a lot of focus, it turns into almost like a ADD type of struggle where they are hyper focused, but they're hyper focused to an unhealthy degree where they can't get out of some tasks that they're focusing on and take a break. So some of those things can be issues. We can also have issues with developing our egg and not necessarily have that be the best egg that could have been developed. Sometimes we have DNA that's damaged. And so women will see this in their body in the form of sometimes a miscarriage. And what can happen is we need to make sure that we're preparing and feeding our body with enough nutrients in order for us to develop an egg with DNA and all of the nutrients that egg is going to need to survive once it is fertilized, because sometimes we are not necessarily taking care of ourselves as well as we should. And that egg that develops, sometimes because of nutrient deficiencies, we have DNA that gets transposed, it gets moved around. And because of that, some of those movements will early on in an embryo's development mean that it can't survive. So those are some things that we need to consider and why nutrition really is important for women who want to get and stay pregnant. The next thing is we can sometimes have a follicular phase that's too long, and that is not necessarily as difficult or big of an issue, but it can make predicting ovulation difficult for women who are trying to conceive or trying to prevent conception through natural rhythm methods. So that's something to consider. If you have a longer follicular phase, you might be underestimating when your ovulation is taking place. So therefore you might be having unprotected intercourse and fun time when you actually are ovulating. So I actually talk about in my Feminine Rhythms course a little bit of ways that you can start to see how your body might be ovulating. So you can predict that and learn your own rhythm so you know if that is the type of birth control method you want to use, how you can detect that and be a little bit more cautious when you need to. The other issue that some women have is that their follicular phase is too short. And really this can be very, very difficult for women who are trying to conceive. When we have a follicular phase that's too short, it butts up against our menstrual phase. So if you're menstruating and then you maybe only have a few days of your follicular phase before you start ovulating, that can make it very difficult to predict ovulation. First of all, it can be difficult to be able to conceive because there is such a short time period from when you were just bleeding and shedding your uterine lining to when you actually are having an egg that's ready to be able to be fertilized and implant. And so some of those things might be struggles that women are facing if they are, one, not able to know when they're ovulating, and two, if that is something that they have been able to predict and it's getting a little close to their menstrual cycle, then there are ways where we can start to extend that, provide enough nutrients for our body for different areas. And I'll talk about that in the last two videos, because those two areas are going to impact some of how our menstrual phase and our follicular phase happen as well. So one of the things that we can consider is that this phase ideally is about 7 days long. It's approximately 7 days. Like I said, it could be shorter, it could be longer, within a certain range. So it's not the same every month normally, and it's not necessarily the same for every woman. They're going to have to look for signs of ovulation to be able to detect when their follicular phase ends. So that'll be different for everybody, but ideally it should be the development of their egg, and there are usually a few eggs that are developing when one starts to predominate by the end of the follicular phase, and that is the egg that then would be put into the fallopian tube for fertilization. So those are things that we can keep in mind, and we'll talk next a little bit about what things we can consider lifestyle and nutrition wise to be able to support ourselves during this phase. You might be asking yourself, how can we support ourselves in the follicular phase? Like I had talked about, this is going to be a time where we're going to be more outward facing. In our seasonality, it's kind of the equivalent of spring. So we are starting to blossom into what will be kind of the summertime of our season. And so that can be compared to fertilizing. So really, as we're developing an egg, we need to make sure that there's enough nutrition for us. And even if you aren't trying to conceive, you might want to consider what nutrients you are putting in your body, because I'll talk a little bit in the luteal phase about the importance of that egg for women who are not trying to conceive. So that is something you still want to keep in mind, because that egg is going to turn into something that's going to help keep you mentally stable, physically stable. So just keep that in mind as well. We'll talk about that in a few weeks, but really this is going to be an outward facing time. So the menstrual phase was inner resting, winter time. Now springtime, what do we usually do in the spring for those of us who garden? We fertilize. We're setting the foundation for the summertime, the production. So that's the equivalent of ovulation. But what we can do in this time is make sure that we have enough nutrients for our body to be able to build that egg well. So I've talked a little bit about seed cycling, and seed cycling is really important in this. We're going to have things like zinc to be able to help support our egg production through pumpkin seeds. We're going to also have flax seeds that are going to help with that estrogen production. So how I had mentioned before, we are ramping up that estrogen level and supporting that production with things like the lignans from flax, which can be converted into estrogen very quickly and used for our body to feed that egg with things like estrogen. That is a really important way that we can use in order to set ourselves up. However, someone might want to consider whether that's right for them. Talk with their doctor or their naturopathic doctor as well about whether seed cycling is right for them if they feel like they might be estrogen dominant. You might not necessarily want to take estrogen mimicking foods if that's something you're struggling with. And we do store estrogen in fat, so that's something to consider if you're working on fat loss. That could be something that could be increasing the estrogen levels in your bloodstream if you're trying to lose weight, and if you have had any estrogen that has been stored in fat to protect us from too high levels of estrogen. But that might be something just to keep in mind. And we'll talk a little bit about a few other nutrients as well that can be helpful. But if you're interested in seed cycling, I do have a link in the description below if you want to download my Seed Cycling 101 document, so you can learn about seed cycling, how it can be used, and how the benefits of that really can reflect in your life. Next, I want to talk about a few other vital nutrients that really can play an important role in our oocyte or egg development. And the first is folate or folic acid. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is partly because of what I had mentioned earlier are some of the issues that women can have with their follicular phase. And that can be things like not developing an egg, or developing an egg that isn't ideal and might have DNA disruptions, essentially. And so that egg, even if it's fertilized, might miscarry because it's not necessarily had the DNA where it's going to develop beyond about 7 or 8 days, sometimes maybe a few weeks. But that's because those DNA are protective in that we kind of fold in as an embryo within that initial phase. And if we don't have that folding process because DNA is missing that signals that, we can have lots of developmental issues that can lead to babies not being able to have a fully formed skull and brain or spinal cord, which really wouldn't make them viable. So in order to help us as women prepare our bodies and make sure that we have eggs that are high quality, that are going to have the DNA that they need to produce, folate and folic acid is really important. They're really important in preventing what are called neural tube defects. And these are common defects that before we had prenatal vitamins were very common, and women were struggling with having children that weren't viable and didn't live very long because of it. And so some of these are considered essential for women who are trying to conceive, but you might want to consider you're developing your egg. At this point, it might have started to be developed within that menstrual phase. You actually are starting to develop that 14 days before it's going to ovulate. And we can sometimes lose B vitamins very quickly, within about a day. We urinate them out. Our kidneys are very efficient at filtering those from our body. And so keeping those stores high, because we don't actually have stores of B vitamins in our body, they're something that gets used and they aren't recycled. So that is something that is a vital nutrient for any woman who really is going to be trying to conceive. And for us women who might not necessarily be trying to conceive, it still can be important because, as I have mentioned, we are going to be developing an egg that is later going to benefit us in our life, no matter whether we're trying to get pregnant or not. So just keep that in mind. Again, I'll be mentioning that in the luteal phase of our videos here. So just keep that in mind, that folic acid is something that can be a little bit more difficult for us to get from our diet. So some women choose to supplement with that. Before introducing any supplement, definitely check with your doctor to make sure it's the right fit for you. But I'll talk about some foods where you can be able to get folate and folic acid as well. A few sources of folate are items like dark green leafy vegetables. We'll talk about more of those in the next 2 weeks as well. But those are really great sources for folate, as well as things like Brussels sprouts, broccoli, and beans. Now, making sure that we're getting enough of these in a wide variety can ensure that we are having this phase look ideal, that we are getting what we need, and we're not necessarily experiencing that anxiety or the lack of an egg developing or other things that are going to later on have an effect. And so next week, I'll actually be talking about some of the downstream effects of anovulation, which I mentioned in this video as well, which can start showing in this phase, but we'll talk about those next week so that you can have that in the frame of ovulation. So this week, we're just talking about egg development and what this follicular phase can look like. Another few sources of folate are items like lentils, cantaloupe, and avocados. So as you can see, a lot of these could be meals that are all put together in one. And so we're having a folate-rich meal that are going to not only help support us with our estrogen production during this time, fueling our exercise, but also making sure that we're having enough folate for proper egg development. Now you know a little bit more about our feminine rhythm in the follicular phase, how we can live in this phase of our life optimally, what it should look like, what it shouldn't look like, and how we can support ourselves nutritionally in order to have this be an ideal picture. If you want to learn more, I have both the seed cycling document as well as a free upcoming Feminine Rhythms Masterclass that you can sign up for in the link to this video. And in April, I'll be holding a Feminine Rhythms course. So that'll be a whole 12-week course about our feminine rhythm if you need to get yours back in beat. And so I'd love to share that with you. So sign up for the list below and you'll be able to find out about that when it comes out. And I really hope that this is helpful for you and that you're able to learn more about your body and how to support yourself. Until next time, be well.